Good afternoon. This afternoon we'll be looking at a group of kings who very much reverse the trends of history as far as Egypt and its southern neighbour Nubia are concerned. Now here we have the Nile Valley comprising the modern states of Egypt and Sudan. And here is the area which we call Nubia, which basically spans the southern part of the Arab Republic of Egypt and the northern part of the Democratic Republic of Sudan. In ancient times, this was Nubia and always was a place of significant interest to the ancient Egyptians because of the sheer amount of resources which it made available. These are both resources which were native to Nubia itself, exotic stones, and in particular gold. The gold mines of Nubia were really, really important to the economy of Egypt. But also it was a conduit for trade coming from deeper into Africa. And as such, the Egyptians always had a significant interest in the area. The nature of this varied slightly with time. In the Old Kingdom, it seemed to have been very specifically aimed at particular resources. For example, the amazing stone which Khafre's statue in the Cairo Museum is made of is from a quarry in Nubia, which is about the only place where this stone can be found. Then, in the Middle Kingdom, a rather more solid kind of control was exercised down to the Second Cataract, effectively on the modern Egypto-Sudanese border, where above that, so in the area directly north of that was taken under direct Egyptian control, and then a complex of fortresses were built on the cataract, partly as military places, but also as places for managing trade. So during the Middle Kingdom, there is an attempt to monopolise any kind of contact with the area south of the Second Cataract. Oops, hang on. Then, during the New Kingdom, the whole of Nubia became a formal dependency of Egypt. It became a viceroyalty controlled by the Viceroy of Kush, or King's son of Kush, to give him his exact Egyptian title. And this is a scene from the tomb of Hui, who was the Viceroy under Tutankhamun, showing the kinds of things which were available from Nubia. Everything from slaves, who can be seen in the top left-hand corner, wearing manacles, through to piles of gold and other resources, which can be seen directly in front of the Viceroy there. Also cattle, a whole range of items anyway, including things coming from even further south. And in many ways, that Nubia underpinned much of the New Kingdom's power, particularly the gold available from there allowed Egypt to pay its way in many ways in the international relations of the New Kingdom. When you get begging letters from the king of Babylon, for example, claiming that gold was as dust in the land of Egypt. And then, at the end of the New Kingdom, Nubia is lost to Egypt. There is considerable economic and other problems, falling ultimately in some ways as fallouts from the late Bronze Age collapse of many of the civilizations of the Levant. But also, there's also indications of civil war going on, and also there is conflict spreads into northern Nubia. But exactly who is fighting who there becomes slightly unclear. But the bottom line is that by the early 21st dynasty, Nubia is lost to Egypt. And one of the last people to hold the title of Viceroy is the gentleman on the left of the screen here. That is Herihor, who's also the high priest of Amun at Karnak. And in this scene from the Khonsu temple at Karnak, he's shown on the same scale as his nominal superior, Ramesses XI. And of course, as you're well aware, relative size in Egyptian art is absolutely crucial to defining how people stand in the hierarchy, and a high priest of the same size as the king says something about the relationship. Then Herihor then goes on to become king of southern Egypt, but by this time Nubia is gone, and it may well be that the loss of the gold fields of Nubia is one of the reasons why during the late 20th and in 21st dynasty we have the salvaging of gold from the various royal coffins, which Kara will clearly be talking about in her lecture. The question about what then happens in Nubia after the departure of the Egyptians, or at least the end of Egyptian power in Nubia, remains a matter of debate and is generally referred to as the Nubian Dark Ages. Not necessarily because there was anything dark about what was going on in Nubia during this period, but we just don't really know enough about what's going on at all. So from about 1050 or so through to the 8th century BC, we have very sketchy understanding, if understanding may be a too strong a word for what's going on in this area. We have one or two flashes of data which may be placed in this area. And it should be pointed out that until fairly recently, this data was being placed hundreds of years later. And it's worthwhile pointing out that much of what we think we know about Nubian history is fairly flaky, to put it mildly. But what we do have here at Kawa is a lot of sand. The reason I sort of say that is because the stones you can see here are not the last foundations of a destroyed temple. They're the tops of the walls of a fully preserved temple. And the whole structure, or structures here, it is temples A and B here, have been swallowed up by the sand. Temple A was built under Tutankhamun. Temple B was built under a king called Iri. And this is one of his stela from the site. And Iri is a somewhat elusive character. A key thing to understanding him, I think, comes from his prenomen, Samatre Setepenre, which you will recognise as being that of Ramesses II. And also the format of his nomen, Iri Meriamun, is also very much of the what one would expect from the Ramesside period. And as such, I and a number of other scholars have recently argued that he actually belongs to the Nubian Dark Age. The standard texts, however, place him in the Meroitic period, a number of centuries later, as one of the so-called Neo-Ramesside kings. Interesting enough, when you're looking at the historiography, when Francis Llewellyn Griffith, who discovered this, was minded to place him soon after the Ramesside period, but when he died, his successor as the excavator at Kawa decided to shove them a number of centuries, some centuries further to the right, and place him amongst the Meroitic kings, who for some reason had decided to use titles from centuries earlier on. There was also one of the reasons why he was placed that late was the fact that the Egyptian in the stela isn't particularly brilliant and shows some resemblances to the texts used in Meroitic times. On the other hand, though, the other way of looking at it is if this is a king who is a number of decades after the Egyptian departure, he is taking the most recent Egyptian monarchy as his basis for his regime, and also the relatively poor Egyptian may simply reflect the fact that you've no longer got people that's going to scribal schools in Memphis, and this is becoming a little more of a backwoods kind of place. And he probably can be fitted in quite nicely with another text whose date has been a little bit flaky, but is actually now rather more well understood than had been the case here at Semna on the Second Cataract, which is where the Middle Kingdom kings had built one of their fortresses, and during the New Kingdom, when the fortress was refurbished, a new temple was built there, and on a wall of that was built this was inscribed this tableau of a queen called Katimala. She is she bears a title of King's Great Wife, and the text is talking about some warfare going on. It's unclear whose wife she was. There is no her husband's name isn't given here, and the text again is in not particularly brilliant Egyptian, but the study, Darnell's study of it, shows that its nearest affiliations are from the 22nd dynasty, with a certain amount of debasement. So again, that probably helps put her perhaps in the 10th century BC, perhaps somewhere in that general kind of area. So there's also another block from Jebel Barkal further south of another king who uses the prenomenature of Ramesses XI, who's also been placed amongst these Neo-Ramessides in the Meroitic period, but I think makes far more sense as somebody in the period following the Egyptian withdrawal, during which time the newly independent or regime in Nubia is trying to make sense of what the new state is going to be, and like many other post-colonial powers, is using the former imperial powers' basic approach to kingship, religion, and so on and so forth. The one place where it has been claimed there is some kind of archaeological sequence covering this period is here at El Kuru. El Kuru later becomes the cemetery for the Nubian kings who actually rule in Egypt. It's a fairly desolate-looking place now, and the pyramid on the right is much, much later than the period we're dealing with this afternoon. So ignore that one, please. Here we have the plan of the site with the big pyramid, which isn't really there from the point of view of this afternoon, on the right there, and then this whole patchwork of much, much smaller tombs. And the big question archaeologically has been, since Reisner discovered this cemetery over 100 years ago, it's whether this represents a sequence of tombs belonging to the rulers of Nubia, running from soon after the Egyptian withdrawal through to the point in time where they are actually ruling Egypt, or whether it is a site which has been used on more than one occasion, and whether there's any continuity here. The tumulus tombs towards the back of the cemetery, some of them have been found to contain material which can be datable to the late New Kingdom or slightly after that, and so it's reasonable to put them there. But the big question is whether or not this cemetery was employed and then the site lay fallow for a period before the next set of tombs, which some have been identified as mastabas and some have been identified as pyramids. The remains are somewhat equivocal on the nature of these structures. So this might be a single sequence, or it may be two completely separate sequences. But it's one of the few places where we have some kind of real time depth. Clearly there must be more data out there in Nubia, but the Dark Age remains distinctly gloomy, no matter what you're trying to do with it. Now at the end, archaeologically probably the latest of this group of tombs and largest of them has been, has been identified as the tomb possibly of Kashta, because here's the first of the Nubian rulers who we can actually place in time with confidence, and also for whom we actually have contemporary material. There's also a king called Alara, who is mentioned retrospectively in other texts, but there's nothing actually contemporary which we can actually date to his time. So Kashta. Now, the period directly before Kashta appears on the Nubian throne, which is at the back end of the 8th century BC, Egypt has been undergoing a steady disintegration. Initially, around about 940 BC, the 22nd dynasty of Libyan kings had been established and initially ruled the whole country, with a potential hiccup during the reign of Takelot I. But then, in the second half of the 9th century, we find the breaking away of Thebes as a separate entity, and then Thebes suffering its own internal civil war, which is what is shown by the overlap here between Takelot II and Padubast I. Also, there is evidence that around the same sort of time, another regime, calling itself a kingdom, sets itself up in the southern part of the delta, at various times having some control over the ancient capital of Memphis as well. So as we're moving through towards into the 8th century, Egypt is in a rather sorry state, at least as far as any kind of a unified state is concerned. And at Thebes, the last couple of fully attested rulers are Azorkon III and Takelot III, shown here while Azorkon is king and Takelot III is crown prince and also high priest of Amun. And it's around the end of the reign of Takelot III that we find Kashta appearing in Egypt, and appearing in Egypt in such a way that suggests that rather more has been going on in the previous decades than any of the data available to us can reveal. First of all, at Elephantine, on the Elephantine Island at Aswan, we find a fragment of stela of Kashta has been found, suggesting some kind of official presence there. But rather more remarkably, we find amongst the priestly annals at Karnak, which are a set of texts going back into the early Third Intermediate period, which record the inductions of various priests to the priesthoods at Karnak, we find one dated to year 1 of Kashta. And the fact that you've got an induction of a priest in Thebes at Karnak dated to the reign of Kashta does make it rather apparent that Kashta must now actually be the recognised ruler of Thebes. So exactly how he becomes recognised ruler of Thebes is a slightly more problematic thing, but in some way he follows on from Takelot III. But what's interesting here is that takeover isn't accompanied by any kind of getting rid of current incumbents. It appears that the current high priest, who is of Takelot's family, chugs on quite happily. And the god's wife of Amun, the female counterpoint to the male high priest, who is actually Takelot III's sister, Shephenwepet, also continues along quite happily. And also, meanwhile, in the far north, the old line at Tarnis is still chugging along, although now with a number of other rivals for rulership in the north, which we'll come to shortly. It seems likely that the transition between the regimes is carried out in Thebes, is carried out by a mechanism which we also find some decades later when another incoming dynasty takes over Thebes. And this is by Shephenwepet I, the god's wife of Amun, being prevailed upon to adopt Kashta's daughter Amenerdis as her successor as God's wife. Because since the late New Kingdom, the God's wifeship of Amun seems to have been transmitted by adoption of successive generations of princesses. And these blocks, although in their final form apparently representing the adoption of Nitocris, a later, which we'll be meeting meeting later on, as the heir to Shepenwepet II, a later God's wife, it looks likely that these were originally carved for that first adoption. And what we have at the bottom there is the God's wife, presumably Shepenwepet I, on the podium at the entrance to Karnak, which is the way you enter the temple today, and with a small obelisk, which is still there today. And we'll see that in a later image, greeting Amenerdis, who then goes on to become ultimately her successor. And the two are shown together here in the temple of Osiris Hekajet at Karnak. Now, the reign of Kashta seems to be short, and also may have been cut off by violent means. This is the so-called excommunication stela in Cairo, which can be dated to the reign of Pa or Pianki, the successor of Kashta. As some of you are aware, we have a difficulty in being sure how we actually read the name. It's got an ankh in the middle in the hieroglyphic forms, but it's not there in the hieratic forms. So in the book, you'll see he's written with pi, brackets, ankh, close brackets, y, which is a little bit difficult to say during a lecture like this. So I'll try and call him PA, but if I forget and slip into calling him Pianki, I apologise. Anyway, on this stela, it's it's somewhat flowery in its writing. It talks about something really terrible happening, caused by a bunch of priests at Jebel Barkal, who are then killed as a result. It doesn't say it's about this thing is the murder of Kashta, but the terminology and sort of the apocalyptic sort of nature of what's being happening here has been argued to be the murder of Kashta, which I think is a good as a working hypothesis for this. Now, PA, once he's in power, is a crucial figure in the continuing takeover of Egypt by the Nubians. And from a text which we'll be talking about very, very shortly, around by the 20th regnal year of PA, we have got Egypt in this state. It looks, certainly the south of Egypt and Nubia are all as one. Exactly how far north the kingdom of PA goes isn't known for certain. I've put the border at Asyut as purely for convenience here. But then north of that, we have got a kingdom based at Hermopolis, another one at Heracleopolis. Then we've got the old 22nd dynasty still in existence in the northeastern delta. And then the rest of the delta is split up into a number of other polities, most importantly the kingdom, the princedom of the west, based on Sais, the green one at the top there. As to the relationships between these, again, the text which I'm about to be talking about indicates that the Heracleopolitan kingdom is in some way allied with PA's southern kingdom. And interestingly enough, the king in Heracleopolis, a man called Pefchau Awibast, is the son-in-law of Rudamun, who was a brother of Takelot III. Again, the very fact that he is allied with the Nubians does rather suggest that whatever happened in Thebes with the ending of the rule of the family of Takelot III was not a violent overthrow, and there is some kind of modus vivendi between the two ruling groups. What then happens is that the princedom of the West, so the green bit, then attacks Heracleopolis in conjunction with a number of these other local rulers. And it's at this point that the text kicks in, which is this stela, so-called victory stela of PA, now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, found at Jebel Barkal in Sudan. Because when it was found in the late 19th century, Sudan was effectively a colony of Egypt, and hence all the material found there ended up going to Cairo. Anyway, in contrast to the very flowery wording of the so-called excommunication stela, this is actually quite a good, detailed account of a military campaign, and one wishes that more Egyptian texts were as clear and straightforward as the PA stela. Basically, PA comes to the rescue of Pefchau Awibast. Today, it's not time to give a blow-by-blow account of the campaign, but ultimately what happens is that everybody surrenders to PA. And it's the list of the people who surrendered to him is rather useful historically, because it tells you who actually is in charge where at this point in time. So you've actually got across Egypt, you've got 5 different people all claiming the title of pharaoh, because PA, Kashta, and also going to go back to Iri, are using the normal Egyptian royal titles, even though they are rulers of Nubia. So the only one who isn't a king at this point is Tefnachti, who is chief stroke prince of the West, based in Sais. And there's also a bunch of other local rulers involved who are princes, great chieftains, and a whole range of other things as well. But the key figures, of course, are those who are calling themselves pharaohs. And this is the principal scene of submission at the top of the stela. For some reason, PA's figure has been erased, then re-established. We don't know who erases it and puts it back again, but he is certainly there. So there's PA. And then you've got these 4 mini-pharaohs, if you want to call them that, who are submitting to him. Nimlot, who is the ruler of Hermopolis. He's leading a horse, because one of the gifts he gives as part of his submission is a horse. And also it seems that the Nubian kings are very keen on horses. There's a cemetery of royal horses down near El Kuru, which is the royal cemetery. And also during the siege of Hermopolis, which is part of the whole of the campaign, PA gets very upset because the horses when the siege is lifted, the horses in the stables have gone hungry, and he gets very cross with Nimlot for letting them go hungry, given the reason they went hungry was because the city is being besieged and all the food supplies are being cut off by PA. So whether his argument is that the horses are rather more important than human beings and they ought to be receiving more food is unclear. But there is an important point about horses are a big thing at this point in time, and we're entering a little bit of time whereby the Assyrians appear to be bought off by a gift of horses as well, not long after this. And then you've got the other kings at the bottom there, Zorkon IV of Tarnis, Uput II from the southern delta, and then Pefchau Awibast, who had been the one who had been rescued effectively, although he's still shown as submitting. The only person who doesn't come and submit in person is Tefnachti, who started the whole thing off by invading Heracleopolis. And he sends basically a letter saying, sorry, won't do it again, but then you can have my... And then a commission is sent up to Sais by PA to take his formal submission and receive gifts and so on. At which point PA appears to have no desire to become overlord of the whole of Egypt, and he seems to go back into Nubia, but of course still being the overlord of Thebes. And as soon as he's gone, Tefnachti then assumes kingship as well. So we've got yet another mini pharaoh floating around in northern Egypt, and this is a stele in Athens showing Tefnachti as king. Now, although these are, I'm calling them especially the mini pharaohs, they still have significant importance, particularly the 22nd dynasty representatives at Tanis. And some very interesting reliefs of Azorkon IV turned up a few years ago during the ongoing French excavations at Tanis. And these are two of the blocks, and what's remarkable about them, particularly the one at the bottom left where the face is preserved, is this is almost an exact replica of 3rd dynasty art. We're now talking, Azorkon is floating around in the late 8th century BC. This is a style which went out of fashion in the 25th century BC. So here is something quite remarkable. And this ties in with a trend which we see during that period, during the 8th century, of an increasing attempt to reach back into the past. Possibly everybody's realising that Egypt is not what it once was. With 5 people calling themselves pharaoh, that doesn't really help particularly. And as part of this, we see a major simplification of royal titulary, which had become very, very overblown during this period, in favour of titularies which are more in common with the Old and Middle Kingdoms, with short and snappy names. But also the art. Now, it's often, the 25th and 26th dynasties are often talked of as times of archaizing art, which is true, and we'll follow that up a bit later on. But for true archaism, in the sense of actually copying stuff from the 2,000 years previously, we only find this under, as we can tell, under Azorkon IV and possibly his latter years of his predecessor, Shoshenq V. The fact that these are direct copies of 3rd dynasty art suggests that it's to the time of Azorkon IV, or possibly Shoshenq V, that we should attribute the entry into the step pyramid and the gridding of reliefs there clearly for copying. This has all often been associated with the 26th dynasty, and the corridor leading, which was cut into the step pyramid, which is now open to the public, has often been called the Saite Gallery and so on. But I think the evidence of discovery of these blocks indicates that it's probably Azorkon IV or his predecessor who are responsible for this. And in fact, before these blocks were found, some others had been found, but without the royal names. And those had originally been identified as actually 3rd dynasty blocks. That is how close the style actually is. So I think there's a certain amount of attempts here to try and say go back to the future almost, as far as things are concerned. And also Azorkon is important because there are, although we've got nothing from Egypt, there are biblical and Assyrian references which seem to refer to him as being the person in Egypt who is dealing with foreign policy, and there's one point where he buys off what seems to be an Assyrian attack by giving a large number of horses over to the Assyrians. So although he's somebody who has now submitted to PA, and is in contrast to his ancestor Shoshenq I, is a minor figure, he still actually is playing a role. And at the moment, the Nubians are content, seemingly, of being in control of Nubia and the area up to just perhaps beyond Thebes, leaving the rest of the Egyptian rulers to look after themselves to some degree. PA's death, he is buried at El Kuru, and it's actually the first of the tombs at El Kuru which actually we can be sure who owns it, in the sense that Shabti figures of his were found and other inscribed material was found in the tomb. Very simple tomb. It's simply a chamber which had been cut as a trench in the bedrock and then covered over by a corbelled roof of slabs, and then a sloping passage attached to it. And over the top of this was probably built a pyramid. The pyramid itself is completely gone, but given that later kings of the line have very pointy pyramids on top, suggests that's what we have here. With PA's death, things change somewhat. The next king is a king called Shabataka. Now, the placement of Shabataka as successor to PA may come as a surprise to most Egyptologists, because since the days of Champollion, it had been assumed that PA was succeeded by Shabaka, followed on by Shabataka. And that continued to be the case until the early 21st century, when a number of things, including one which I'll be talking about in a moment, came along, which started to make the conventional ordering of kings somewhat problematic, in the sense that if you have the kings that way round, certain things have to happen chronologically which are not desirable in the broader historical terms. At which point a scholar based in Germany said, what happens if we swap them round? And when they were swapped round, all these problems disappeared. But hang on, hadn't we been always thought that Shabaka and Shabataka were that way round? Well, when you actually look back to why Champollion put it that way round, he just sort of made it up. There is no rationalisation of why the conventional way round was Shabaka, Shabataka, except possibly the fact that the king with a longer name with a ta in it, perhaps ought to be the later of the two. There's nothing more to it than that at all. And the moment you then sort of break that link and swap them round, all the problems which had been building up during the later 20th century as more data was appearing, all disappeared. So, given how conservative Egyptology is, within sort of literally days, but within a couple of years of this proposal coming up, pretty well everybody who does this period is agreed that it's the other way round. Admittedly, there's not a huge number of people who do the period, shall we say, but those of us who do all seem to be perfectly happy it's that way round. The trouble is, of course, it's been the other way round in history books for the last 200 years, so I think it's going to be a long time before people sort of fully grasp which way round it actually is. In fact, in my own book, Afterglow of Empire, had to be partly rewritten between around this sort of new configuration. So basically, if you have the first edition, you have me saying one thing. The second edition says something completely different. And so therefore, if you want that book, buy the second edition, not the first edition, because it's got that view in it. Anyway, so it all seems to work, and there are various papers which will explain that in more detail. But Shabataka seems to have a very different approach to the rule of Egypt as compared with what PA was up to. Because Shabataka seems to actually want to have a hands-on control in Egypt, not just simply be a remote overlord. And part of that, that slide, for some reason, it looks perfectly okay on my own computer, but it goes horrible, so I'm going to ignore that one. The one thing which he does do is he gets rid of the current successor of Tefnachti in Sais. As far as we can see, when he decides to take over more of Egypt, everybody else is left in place except for Bakenrenef, or Bakoris in Greek, the ruler of Sais, who, according to Manetho, insofar as one can believe anything he says, was burned alive by Shabataka. Whether that's actually quite true or not, it does seem that Bakenrenef is set aside. And if one looks at the history of this whole period, Sais is always the bit which is the awkward squad. Tefnachti had tried to take over. It's unclear what his overall objectives were when he attacked Heracleopolis earlier on. Heracleopolis earlier on, but it may well have been to try and become overlord of northern Egypt, and it may well be that Bakenrenef is seen as a threat, although it will turn out that the last laugh is had by the Saites because they will later become the 26th dynasty. But anyway, we have a certain amount of data of him, but we can't necessarily be sure that he really was burned alive, as Manetho alleges. We've got this stela, rather strange-looking stela from the Serapeum, and also this jar of Bakenrenef from Tarquinia in Italy. Quite what that's doing there is anybody's guess. But there's also a lot of late traditions which make Bakenrenef a lawgiver of some description. So there's a whole sort of topic about Bakenrenef. But the important point is that the only dynasty, if you like, of local rulers who are set aside for the time being seems to be the Saites by Shabbataka. A key thing about the takeover of Shabbataka of the north is that he seems to indicate by doing so that he is a king of both Egypt and Nubia. This duality is indicated by the by his adoption of a double uraeus, which is something that the only kings of Egypt ever to have double urae are the Nubian kings. You do get on some funerary material a uraeus and a vulture, as on the Mask of Tutankhamun, but that isn't something otherwise you would find. And this double urae does seem to suggest that one uraeus is for Egypt and one is for Nubia. And the fact that when later on the relief on the left of Shabbataka was usurped by Psamtik II of the 26th dynasty, one of the urae was taken away, indicating that this is probably what it all means. And in most cases, the WRA have been hacked away in later times, but there's a few intact examples. For example, that one of Shabaka on the right there. It looks like the takeover by Shabbataka was complete by year 3, because there is a text which talks about a coronation of Shabbataka at Karnak in his year 3. He also does a certain amount of building here. For example, here on the eastern extremity of Karnak, we have the temple of Osiris Hekajet, the innermost part having been built by Azorkon III and Takelot III, but the outer part by Shabbataka. Then on the southeastern part of the complex, we find a small chapel being built by Shabbataka, the blocks from which are now in Berlin. This head has generally been identified as Shabbataka because it appears to have features which differ from those of other attributable Nubian royal heads, and is comparable certainly with that two-dimensional representation which I showed you previously. That it's a Nubian king, so it's suggested by the overall features, and also by the cap crown he's wearing, which is a distinctive part of the Nubian king's regalia, and is also adopted by contemporary Egyptian kings, their vassals. We also have material dating to Shabbataka at Edfu, a number of blocks which were from a building which seems to have been demolished by the Ptolemies when the current Edfu temple was built. And then one of the most important references we have to Shabbataka is not actually from Egypt at all, but from Iran. This is the famous Tangivar inscription, and part of it speaks about, this can be dated precisely because of the Assyrian data, to the year 706, when Shabataku, who is clearly that's simply the cuneiform writing of Shabataka, extradited Yamani of Ashdod, who was a rebel prince in Palestine, to Assyria. This is actually one of those documents which was key in making us look once again at the correct order of Shabaka and Shabataka, because on the conventional way around, having Shabataka after Shabaka and clearly active in year 706 causes major issues with the overall chronology. But if you swap them round, it's all good. And the Assyrian texts are also interesting in that the fact that Shabataka is the one who is extraditing this fugitive rather than a known king of Egypt like Zorkon IV or a successor of his, is shown in the Assyrian text by them basically saying we've never heard of Nubia before. This is sort of a land which has never sent greetings to predecessors. So actually the appearance of Shabataka actively undertaking the foreign policy here actually provides quite a shock, a surprise to the various potentates of the Near East. And just saying about the recognition of those dates of that allows us to make that a reasonably secure absolute chronology of that period. The extradition of Yamani is not long before the death of Shabataka, and he's buried here in this tomb at Kuru, which is a slightly more elaborate version of the tomb of Pa. As you can see here, that the burial chamber takes the form of cutting in the desert surface, which has then been corbelled roofed. Next, however, the next king, Shabaka, has a fully rock-cut burial chamber. And this was another of the issues around when one is questioning the correct order of the kings, because generally speaking, architectural development is somewhat linear, so having quite a neat rock-cut burial chamber followed by another of these open-cut ones seems a little bit odd. So again, that helps support the idea of this order of kings. The view at the bottom there is a view into the burial chamber of Shabataka with a raised slab on the floor. One of the ways in which Nubian burials differed from Egyptian burials was that, Egyptians generally lay in coffins, simply on the ground. Nubians were buried on beds. It seems from fragments found that the Nubian kings were adopting Egyptian-style coffins, but still wanting to have beds. And simply putting a big, heavy wooden coffin on a bed might not be very secure. What they did was had these raised slabs with cuttings in the corners to receive the legs of the beds. So the actual weight was all on the actual slab of stone, but it looked to the casual observer as though they were on a bed. As far as foreign policy is concerned, Shabaka seems to take a slightly different approach from his predecessor. The very fact that he was prepared to extradite this fugitive suggests that Shabataka was of a view of trying to appease the Assyrians, very much like Zorkon IV had done so by giving them a whole load of horses a few years previously. Shabaka, however, seems to have taken a rather more active role, and in response to various appeals for help from the various Palestinian entities who were trying to avoid being swallowed up by the Assyrians, he certainly sent an army into Palestine, and it seems likely that in some way the presence of this Egypto-Nubian army in Palestine prevented Jerusalem falling in 701 BC. Exactly the details remain obscure, but that seems a reasonable reading of the data. Also, we have, as far as relations with Assyria is concerned, a couple of seal impressions found at Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, which belong to Shabaka, and have also got counter seals from an Assyrian official. These have been sort of rather romantically ascribed to being seals of a peace treaty between Egypt and Assyria, which is possibly taking it a bit too far. But the very presence of this sort of double sealing, which looks more likely to belong to some kind of large jar than some kind of scroll or cuneiform tablet or something, suggests there's something happening between Shabaka and the Assyrians. And it's also interesting that we have no evidence for the Assyrians doing anything nasty towards the Egyptians for another 20 odd years. So something, whether as a result of what happens at Jerusalem, some kind of modus vivendi is created, we just don't honestly know. As so often when trying to assess ancient history, we've got lots of questions, some possible bases for working hypotheses, but very little data which allows us to judge solidly between those potential options. Closer to home, Shabaka continues the sort of archaizing approach to things, including in religion, because we've got the so-called Shabaka stone from the British Museum, which purports to be a transcript from a worm-eaten papyrus and gives a theological text which is allegedly goes back to the Old Kingdom. Whether it really does so or not has been a matter for debate over the years. Whether this is because we certainly have examples in Egypt of texts which are allegedly of a certain date, but you can prove from grammatical oddities that they are actually much later than that. So whether this is based on a real old text, or whether it's what's meant to be an old text but isn't quite, we just don't know. But it does certainly tie in with what we're talking about for art, names and so on, an attempt to try and situate the new Egypt back in, ideologically at least, further in the past. And the Nubians in some way always seem to suggest that they are actually more Egyptian than the Egyptians, and wanting to actually take the country back to a purer past. Also from the point of view of cults and so on, at Karnak, a significant amount of work is done by Shabaka. He also does work at Memphis and other sites as well. And at Karnak, the hold of the Nubians on the cult of Ammon is shown by the fact that we now have Horemachet, who is actually a son of Shabaka as high priest, and Amenerdis I is continuing on for the time being as God's wife, although by now probably in her 80s. And as far as the building work is concerned at Thebes, well, at Karnak, Shabaka seems quite interested in the area of the Ptah temple on the southern flank of the enclosure. And he erects a gateway at the Ptah temple. He also adds a new doorway to the pylon at Luxor temple, further to the south, and then adds a pylon to the small temple of Amun at Medinet Habu. And it's quite interesting that his principal work is all to do with making new entrances to things. And if we look at his successor, Taharqa as well, his big emphasis is building new gateways or colonnades entering temple complexes, which suggests an attempt to get the maximum bang for buck, in the sense that this is the bit of the temple everybody can see. If it's a new outermost gateway, even more people can see it. So you're trying to spread yourself around to get the most recognition for using a relatively modest amount of resource. Another sort of aspect of Shabaka's construction work is probably to be seen in this graffito in the Wadi Hammamat, which was used extensively for the extraction of more exotic stones than the limestone or sandstone, which was the core parts of most of these other buildings. So certainly Shabaka is certainly doing a lot. And interestingly enough, neither Shabataka or Shabaka seem to have any monuments visible at Jebel Barkal, the main monumental centre in Nubia. They seem to do, as quite often seems to be the case when you've got kings who are taking over a bigger and more wealthy kingdom. They sort of their home territory seems to be slightly neglected. A good example, I think, is probably James VI and sixth of Scotland and first of England. Once he became King of England, he never bothered going back to Scotland again, and just from that point onwards, Scotland was a backwater. And I wonder to get whether the feeling is that these Nubian kings, particularly as they are presenting themselves fundamentally as Egyptian kings, really rather take the view that Egypt is rather more fun than Nubia. Although they still go back there in death, and here we've got the entrance to the pyramid of Shabaka. Once again, the pyramid itself is long gone, but now, in contrast to his predecessor, he has now a nice rock-cut burial chamber, and there were traces on the walls of inscriptions, unfortunately in such poor condition owing to flooding that it was impossible to read them. As we'll see a bit later on, we do have a much less damaged Kushite royal tomb to give you an idea of what the interior of this originally looked like. Shabaka is followed on the throne by Taharqa, who is generally held up as being the last great pharaoh of the Nubian period, in fact probably the greatest king. And unlike his predecessors, he not only undertakes building work in Egypt, but also in Nubia as well. Most particularly at Jebel Barkal, the holy mountain of Ammon in the depths of Nubia. Now on the left there, you can see this rock pinnacle, which looks a bit like a crowned cobra. People had thought that right the way back to at least Ramesses II, because we have a relief from Ramesses II's time, which shows the front of Jebel Barkal as with a rearing cobra. And Taharqa enhances this because in fairly recently, examination of that pinnacle has shown that Taharqa added made some changes to the rock, the shape of the rock, and also added various pieces of gold sheeting to enhance that kind of view. And at the bottom, below the Great Pinnacle, he built Temple B300, rather prosaically known that by Reisner. And this temple is a mixture of a rock-cut interior with colonnaded exterior, with these two Hathor-headed columns still surviving. And in the rock-cut part, we find these colossal statues of Bez. It's interesting when one looks at the religion as sort of seen in Nubia, or Kush, which is the ancient word for it, in that a lot of features of it are based on Egyptian religion, but with tweaks. For example, Ammon of Napata, who is the god who is principally worshipped at Jebel Barkal, has a ram head rather than the human head of the Egyptian Ammon. And also, Bez in Egypt is generally speaking quite a minor deity. Amulets for pregnant women, household protection, stuff like that. You don't generally get colossal Bezes in Egypt, but you do in Nubia. So it's quite an interesting sort of aspect of that. Also, Taharqa is active at Kawa, which we saw earlier, with Iri's stela, and this is Temple T at Kawa. Again, these aren't the last traces of the foundations. These are the upper parts of the walls of the temple. Excavated during between the wars by a British expedition, as a result of which some of these granite rams of Taharqa are in the UK, and also this small chapel now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford is from this particular site. But in spite of having done work in Nubia, once again, Taharqa is keen to do work and have presence in Egypt itself. At Karnak, we have a number of things to do with him. First of all, this is the podium which I showed in an ancient relief earlier on when I was talking about the arrival of the god's wife of the moon. That is actually the podium, and you can see the baby obelisk, which is part of that. So here, this one here is what we actually saw on that. And during the later Third Intermediate period, the podium was used for marking the maximum height of the various floods of the Nile. And the highest of all of them recorded in Taharqa's year 6 is shown here, and in more detail at the top there. Now high Niles often are as bad as low Niles. The ideal for agriculture in Egypt was to have a nice in-between one. But sometimes they were well down and some well up. And it's interesting when one looks at records surviving of Nile levels, low Niles or high net Niles are often associated with some kind of problem, civil wars and that kind of thing. And therefore one might expect this very, very high flood under Taharqa to be potentially disastrous, but apparently not, because Taharqa has left a number of stelae in which there's almost to a degree of his own surprise that this actual high Nile had some plus points, including getting rid of snakes and various other things. So, and the fact that it is something that is important, there's a number of texts of his which talk about it. So, also to do with the Nile, we have a bit further along on the waterfront at Karnak, this ramp you can see in the middle. You can see there's an original lower angle ramp either side of it. That lower angle ramp, the original one, which is these ones here and here, date probably to the 22nd dynasty, when the whole of the sort of facade of the temple was reworked. But one of the features of the hydrology at Karnak is the fact that the river moves back westwards steadily over time. Originally, the inner part of the temple was an island going back to the Middle Kingdom, but by the time we get to the New Kingdom, it's moving further and further west, allowing space for the hypostyle hall and all those other sorts of things. Then, in the century or so between the building of the original ramp and Taharqa's time, the river moved even further. And these ramps were intended for the loading and unloading of material from boats on the Nile. So clearly, this extra ramp, which reaches further out into the Nile, was a result of a need to carry on an ability to land and embark material from Karnak under Taharqa. And then the final thing which he does is follows the same playbook as Shabaka and adds colonnades to the approaches. So you can see that there is, whether you're approaching Karnak from the north, south, west or east, you've got to go through a colonnade of Taharqa. And the most impressive of these is the colonnade in the first courtyard, what's now the first courtyard anyway, approaching the second pylon. So these huge columns along there are all part of that. During his time, Amenerdis finally dies and is replaced as God's wife by Taharqa's sister, Shepenwepet II. So, and these God's wives are an important part of the building process at Karnak, but also another important person is this man Monshuimhat, who was the mayor of Thebes, but also fourth prophet of Amun, so number 4 in the hierarchy. But he seems to have been the man who did stuff at in Thebes, and we have inscriptions which show that he is responsible for some of the work carried out by Taharqa at the site. These statues are quite interesting. The one on the left there shows what's now happening as far as archaism is concerned in art. Up to the neck, the statue on the left could quite easily be Old or Middle Kingdom. But from the neck upwards, the naturalistic face and so on is completely not that. So what we've had is moved on from this slavish copying under Zorkon IV to a rather more nuanced approach, whereby, say, the approach to carving the body is going back to the past, but the facial working is done in a much more contemporary kind of style. And so everything seems to be going on quite swimmingly for Taharqa. And then the Assyrians come back. So there's been at least 20 or even 30 years since any kind of negative engagement with the Assyrians. But in 674, Esarhaddon of Assyria launches an abortive invasion. We don't know the detail of it. All we know is it was tried and didn't come off. But then 4 years later, another invasion is launched, and there it all starts to unravel. Taharqa, according to this is all from Assyrian sources. There's nothing in Egyptian sources for this. Taharqa is wounded by 5 arrows. Memphis is seized. Members of the royal family are captured. Taharqa retreats back to Nubia, and the various local Egyptian rulers all become Assyrian vassals rather than Nubian vassals, so emphasising we've still got all these mini pharaohs and things floating around, in spite of the fact that the Nubians are the headline pharaohs. There's still all these people still floating around. But the next year, Never Say Die is clearly Taharqa's motto. He's back in Memphis again, and then rather usefully, Esarhaddon is dead. So the person who has been driving the attack on Egypt is no longer in the picture. So we have a couple of years of to draw breath, but then the new Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal II, invades, and Memphis is occupied once again, and the various local mini-kings and so on go back to being Assyrian vassals again. In all of this, however, these local kings, local princes and whatever, they seem to be somewhat ambivalent about where they think they ought to be. It seems quite clear, this is purely sort of from what happens events-wise, is that the local rulers were never quite happy to be subordinate to the Nubians. If one thinks about Egyptian attitudes to the Nubians going back to the Old Kingdom, it's always vile Kush. These are the people who are to provide slaves. Okay, during the New Kingdom they provide rather good policemen, but generally speaking, these are a subordinate race, shall we put it in those kinds of terms. So one assumes that probably these deep-seated cultural attitudes were still there, and then when somebody else comes along who's clearly going to beat up the Nubians, you sort of go in and you applaud and join with them. But then the next year, in 666, rather an ominous year, but in 666, the vassals decide actually that the Nubians were better than the Assyrians. It's rather careful what you wish for kind of thing. So they then all plot to bring Taharqa back. Unfortunately, the Assyrians get wind of this plot. They're all carted off to Assyria and executed. With one exception, Nekhal I of Sais, who remains loyal to the Assyrians. And this all goes back, I think this is part of the theme which goes back to Tefnachti, that Tefnachti is that the Saites are the anti-Nubians. And they are at least consistent with what they're doing here. Anyway, in 664, Taharqa finally dies and is buried in the most impressive of all the Nubian royal tombs, the pyramid Nu 1 at Nuri. This pyramid is by far the biggest pyramid ever built in Nubia. It's actually about the size of the third pyramid of Giza. And it's quite the most likely reason why he's not buried at Kuru. There's no space left at Kuru for something as big as this. The pyramids around it are later ones, but he builds this great pyramid. Interior-wise, it's not just simply a single chamber. It's got columns, it's got a surrounding passageway. In fact, in many ways, it looks rather like the Osirian of Seti I at Abydos, and some have argued that it's meant to be a copy of that. And he also has over 1,000 shabtis, which I think is the largest load of shabtis of any person who's buried under Egyptian sort of rites. It's because there's so many of them that every museum has got one. Once the Sudanese and Reisner had distributed them between themselves, there were so many that then they were passed on as gifts to other museums. So Taharqa is dead. Egypt is being ruled by a bunch of mini pharaohs and local rulers who owe their allegiance to Assyria, because presumably the Assyrians then appoint a whole load of new ones, with the exception of Nekau, who's still there in Sais. But there is a final last gasp attempt to revive Nubian rule over Egypt by Tanat Amun, the nephew and successor of Taharqa, and in this so-called dream stealer, which is now in the Nubian Museum in Aswan, but was also originally found at Jebel Barkal. He talks about having a dream which leads him to try and reclaim Egypt for Nubia. It seems likely that Nubian control continues to exist down in Thebes even while everything else is going on in Egypt. And there he builds this small temple of Osiris Ptah Nebank, rather pointedly including his predecessor Taharqa in parts of the decoration. So he pushes on up to Memphis, takes it, and now he executes Nekau I. Being a local ruler during this period was probably not a very safe thing to be. But Nekau I's son, Psamtik I, flees to Assyria. And probably, although it's not stated anywhere, comes back later that year with Ashurbanipal II for the latest invasion of Egypt by the Assyrians. They sack Thebes, but then withdraw back to Assyria, because by now Babylon is becoming a problem, and it's not long before, it's only a few years before the complete collapse of the Assyrian Empire. So it's gone from this point of being conquering Egypt to being nothing but in a relatively short period of time, which leaves, although there's still a nominal overlordship of the Assyrians, Psamtik is probably the key figure, because he's the one of a family who hadn't been executed. And I suspect that the Assyrians did him a favour, because all the potential rivals had all been given the chop after the conspiracy of the vassals. And so although we're now out of sort of Nubian history, but just very briefly, what happens over the next decade is that Psamtik I, founder of the 26th dynasty, manages to get rid of his various rivals, and finally in 655 manages to take Thebes back under his wing to formally reunify Egypt. And what's rather interesting is there are no longer any mini kings or whatever. Psamtik now reinstates a unitary Egyptian monarchy for the first time in centuries. Part of that Reunification, as I already mentioned, is the adoption of Psamtik's daughter, Nitocris, by Shepenwepet II. And the two ladies are shown here on this relief together. And she's even still called daughter of Pa as well. So again, very much like the way that the Nubians originally took over Thebes, it's being taken over by the Saites seems to have been done in a diplomatic manner rather than by some violent takeover. And that diplomacy is reflected by the way that the gods' wives carry on through the normal adoption process, and Shepenwepet II remains floating around as God's wife for some years. And likewise, Shabaka's grandson, Horimakhet, also remains around as high priest. So the Nubians are not expelled, but they sort of wither away, rather. Tutankhamun, we don't know how long he rules after the end of his time in Egypt. Indeed, once we get from here on in, we don't really have any direct evidence of regnal reign lengths for any Nubian kings, and the succession is largely based on Reisner's assessment of the typological and topographical development of the royal cemeteries. But we do have Tutankhamun's pyramid, the last person to be buried at El Kuru until that much later pyramid is added. And here we've got the burial chamber, still in fairly good condition, although partly flooded. It never suffered as badly as Shabaka's next door one. And we have decoration here, which is really very much a distillation of material from the Ramesside royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Beyond Tutankhamun, the royal succession in Nubia carries on right through to around 350 AD, which is when the last of the successor regimes finally ends, during which time we have got a lot of monuments being produced. Kings continue to be buried in pyramids. We have temples ultimately of Egyptian design, but increasingly we find things which are more local. For example, the presence of queens on temple facades smiting enemies, something which we only find the only queen we find in Egypt to do that is Nefertiti. And that is only on some fairly subsidiary locations, but here we've got on the pylon of the temple in the bottom right-hand corner a queen smiting. Anyway, that was very much a sort of summary of the kind of material which is covered in much more detail in the Nubian Pharaohs, which a copy has been waved at you already and you're visible there and is available at 30% off, etc., etc., etc. So thank you for your attention this afternoon. Sorry about the sort of fun and games at the beginning, but we got there in the end. And I'm happy to take any questions. Any questions out there? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I'm wondering, with the Wadi Hammamat graffiti, do we have a secure date for that? Or
No.
how secure do we have? Because I think I saw Amenerdis' name.
Yeah,
there.
so all the names we've got are Shabaka and Amenerdis.
Okay.
So it's sometime during that reign,
Yeah.
sometime during Shabaka's reign.
If only.
Yes. Any more for any more? Yes.
Thank you so much. This is such unknown territory, and I can't wait to read your book. I follow you very much. The last time we saw you, it was the time of Ramses II on the Golden Pharaohs, and that was a monumental exhibition to be on. And our next exhibition will be about the Etruscans from the heart of ancient Italy. And that one will enlighten people as much, I hope. And we have asked for some of Bach and Reneff's materials that were found in the Tarquinian
Uh-huh.
tomb. And hopefully we will be successful in getting them. But it was always such an interesting thing to see in the Tarquinian Museum. And I thought that perhaps it was because of the Etruscan natural resources and even work goods, that perhaps there was this trade that brought the Egyptian things to an Etruscan tomb. And I'm looking forward to learning more about that. Is there anything you might say?
Yeah, I think the thing is, what the strange thing about Bakenrenef is that he has as an afterlife, as a lawgiver. He's sort of, some sources sort of regard his laws as being the ancestors of those of Solon in Athens, and which is very odd for somebody who, as far as the Egyptian end of things, is almost unknown. A suggestion has been is that the reason why he becomes this thing, which then becomes often he becomes an international phenomenon, if you like, as a legal precursor, is because he's useful for Psamtik I, who's probably his great-great-great-grandson or great-great-great-nephew or something like that, to have somebody like that in his line if what Psamtik is trying to do is to impose his own rule over the whole of Egypt. Having this sort of this hero, particularly if that hero had then been killed by these dastardly Nubians, he's a good person to then have as your... And if that campaign about Bucurus the Wise, which he's called in some sources, he's talked about in Diodorus and all that kind of thing, if that then coincides with him getting the Greeks in at Naucratis, then Greeks who are going in and out of Egypt to trade at Naucratis may then be carrying that. If that's a big bit of propaganda going on at that time, that propaganda is then going on into Greece, and then, of course, from there across the sort of the European world. So, and if when they're looking, and if you're looking for sort of somebody who is the inspiration of Solon, to try and also have this idea of law as being something which is almost an independent thing, rather than necessarily a reflection of a particular culture. If you are a Greek lawgiver, if you can say that I'm taking this from this great quasi-legendary figure of Egypt, the source of wisdom and all wisdom and all that, that probably makes it easier to sell than if it's actually your own law code which you've been cooking up yourself. Because it's always better to refer to. It's like when you're doing any kind of negotiation. There's always somebody who is behind you, who is never going to actually get involved in the negotiation, but you're referring to the person. Now, at one level, it's sorry, my wife won't allow me to buy that, so therefore you can sort of get out of that particular haggling in a market or something. But that sort of thing. So I think that's where, and if by that time he has become this legendary figure of law, and given that the Etruscans clearly have some links with that, then stuff which it has Bakenrenef's name on it becomes quite something, a desirable thing to have. So I'm wondering whether that's the reason why this is a treasured thing. He's managed to pay a huge amount of money possibly for something which dates to the time of the great lawgiver who lies behind Athenian law and all those sorts of things. And that's the reason why and there's a few other bits and pieces have turned up in Italy like that, whether it's part of that. It's actually ultimately a thing which Psamtik was doing to try and to solidify his position in Egypt, but that has sort of then spread more widely. That's sort of my thought of what might be going on here anyway.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I'm curious, during this period in Nubia, were the forts operated by the Nubians?
No, the forts had all gone out of use at the end of the New Kingdom. In fact, some of them gone out of use at the end of the Middle Kingdom. So the fortification of the Second Cataract has ended. There are some strongholds, particularly like Khazar-Ibrim, which seems to have been fortified for the first time in the 22nd dynasty. So during the time when of the Nubian Dark Ages, so possibly reflecting some kind of fear that the resurgent Nubians might be an issue. But no, we've got nothing. We've got nothing from those sites. And of course, the problem is that Lower Nubia is now completely under Lake Nasser. So anything which wasn't spotted during the Nubian rescue campaign is gone. But I'm not aware of any material from any of the forts suggesting a refortification at that period. Yes?
Talking about how much the Nubian rulers and their high associates spent, how much time they spent actually in Egypt proper, other than the god's wife of Amun, were there senior officials whom these Nubian pharaohs named to outposts?
There are a few. There doesn't appear to be any kind of Nubianization of things. There's a few individuals at Thebes. Some of the tombs, a couple of tombs which have recently been re-excavated out in the South Assyrian belong to people from the early part of it. But it becomes increasingly difficult to actually tease out people who are really Nubians versus not, because a lot of them are now using, okay, it's easy enough where you've got Nubian names, but an awful lot of them don't. Even some members of the Nubian royal family have got perfectly good Egyptian names, Merit Amun, Isetemkeb and things like that. So trying to work out how many of these people really are Nubians and how far they aren't. Because the Nubians seem to go out their way to emphasise that they are the real Egypt. It's not a Nubian takeover per se, and it looks as that people are having names which mix and match as well. So.
And then conversely, the Thebans and whoever are, so the Nubians trust the Thebans and vice versa because it's nicer than being sacked by Assyria.
Yeah, I think Upper Egypt is a slightly different kettle of fish from Lower Nubia, because whatever has happened, Thebes has been taken over first. It's these various local rulers who in the north who are jealous of their own control. I think the issue is they realise that somebody's probably going to be their boss. They don't want it, but whoever their boss turns out to be, they don't want them to be their boss. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss, kind of thing. Yeah.
I have one more question. The temple at Philae, I read it somewhere that that was sort of the last bastion of Egyptian religion, and that the Nubians were very active there.
Yeah, Philae is somewhere, certainly the Nubians, well, let's take back a sec. The very earliest evidence we have of anything out on Philae is reign of Taharqa. There is a bark stand, a granite bark stand, which was found there of Taharqa. So it's possible the whole thing kicks off. And certainly during sort of Ptolemaic times, when we've got the most data, you've got Nubians who are going up to Philae effectively as pilgrims. So there's certainly a great interest there because, again, although there are local aspects, the original in Nubia is fundamentally the Egyptian one. So yeah, right the way through. And it's possible, one of the reasons why Philae keeps going for as long as it does is because of of it being patronised from the south as well. And actually also Lower Nubia, although most of them, it seems fairly clear that after Tutankhamun, the kingdom of Kush is really above the Second Cataract. There are points where Nubian kings do make it further north, and the Temple of Dacca, for example, has been partly built by a Nubian king and then finished off by a Ptolemaic king. So, yes?
Those temples or structures you showed pictures of that are completely covered in sand except the stuff sticking out of the top. Were those excavated at one point?
Yes, they were all excavated by an Oxford expedition in 1920s to 30s. That's when a number of stelae were found there, which are now in Copenhagen.
And then the sand.
Yeah, it's one of those places where you can't. Actually, from the point of view of the monuments, they're probably better off under the sand. But yeah, it's one of those places where if you did clean them down to the foundations, probably a couple of weeks later, they'd be almost. So when you do go there today, guides will sometimes sort of dig a bit away so you can just see a bit of the decoration. But it's a good sort of. I think it's probably about as high as this room is probably the overall level of sand. It's very sandy there. Yes, sir.
I don't know enough about this period. Sort of do you have, in terms of things like the Nubian Dark Ages or the kind of the period after the Nubian Pharaohs, came back to Kush, do you think that the material is still around and unexcavated, or is it likelier that just some time periods just we don't have anything left?
It ought to be there. Certainly what's happening on after all this will be made better if we could actually understand the Meroitic writing, which is because from the sort of the end of the New Kingdom through to a century or two after Tutankhamun, Egyptian is what's used for everything, although it's quite often a rather debased Egyptian. But there is also the underlying native language, Meroitic, which then starts being used for stelae from that point onwards, both in the cursive form and also a hieroglyphic form as well, which we still don't understand. It's one of the great lost languages is Meroitic. And although we can transliterate bits of it, we can read names and get a gist sometimes, it's still one thing. And one of the things which people were looking for is the Nubian Rosetta Stone, effectively. Because there are these links with Egypt and also with the classical world, somewhere along the line there might be a bilingual Meroitic stroke to Egyptian or Greek or something, but we haven't found it. I'm sure there must be more material out there. The area of Nubia is huge. The areas which have been excavated still relatively small. And although a lot of the material which is known it tends to be much later. But there must be levels which go back to the Nubian Dark Ages, and it's possible there's going to be something coming found. Let's say the whole it's in comparison with even the dodgier parts of Egyptian history, Nubian history, when it's not in contact with Egypt, is very, very flaky. And the very fact that, say, our royal succession is still based on 100-year-old guesswork, but thoughts by Reisner is quite a worry. And so the placement of Iri in the Meroitic period, again, it's a little bit like that I was saying with Champollion. Somebody has said it is like this, so it is, if you know what I mean. And there's actually not, and I think it's also the whole Shabaka question is why it's important to understand the history of Egyptology. There's so much of which we assume, which has always been what we're told. It's what we're told. In your Egyptology 101 class, that's what you get. It's sometimes only when you start to try. Well, where did that come from? Well, it was what Champollion guessed 200 years ago. We have to be quite careful with things like that. So, anyway, any more? Yes.
Is there any evidence that Tutankhamun actually went down to Nubia when you were building those temples?
None at all. And in fact, it looks like it's all being done by Hui, the viceroy, because Hui's memorials are more prominent than you might normally expect in that kind of thing. And in fact, the same goes under Ramesses II, that a lot of his buildings are done by Setau, who is his viceroy. Mm-hmm. So I think they're slightly more arm's length. But on the other hand, it is interesting that in Nubia, both Tutankhamun and Ramesses II are full-scale gods. It's a little bit like in Roman Empire, where in Rome, an emperor wasn't divine unless he'd been deified by the Senate after his death. But in the provinces, an emperor could be divine even during his lifetime. It's a similar kind, it's that sort of colonial religion versus sort of state religion, if you like. Any more for any more? Well, if not, thank you very, very much for your attention.